All right, this will be my first test on running a very generic method of screen recording, which will be done through Microsoft PowerPoint, so take that for what you will. Today we're going to be discussing the subject of the rapture, more specifically the question of when the rapture occurs, but we will get to that in a minute. A couple of points before we begin. I am using, as I mentioned, a very janky version of screen recording, but at this point, nothing else I've tried has decided to work today. That being said, the quality of a recording should not dictate the quality of the content, I think, as far as this particular subject is concerned, so I will not let it bog me down. Now, before we get into this, the actual texts and the points that I'll be covering, we'll be dealing with questions that range from textually specific to more circumstantial arguments, implications, and so on. But I just want to get the tone right that this is a very casual overview of what eschatology, or what in eschatological circles would be called the rapture, the gathering together of the saints, and we'll get into definitions in a minute here. This is not meant to be a thorough takedown of a particular view. This is not meant to be a thorough explanation of a particular view. This is more meant to be a general overview to kind of get the ball rolling, to get you looking into different texts and different concepts and points and arguments and try to draw it all together to reach a consistent conclusion. One of the regular pitfalls in eschatology is that people are very quick on the presuppositional arguments, so they're very fast to argue with certain things that they have determined to already be resolved. And so it's just kind of this fight back and forth. Well, he said, she said, and well, I think, and you think, and a lot of finger pointing, all without any motivation to actually settle the issue. Because we believe the issue's already been settled and aren't willing to consider any alternative. I am not arguing for an agnostic view, nor am I arguing for a necessarily Gnostic view of this issue or any other issue within the Bible. What I'm trying to do is show that there is a proper way to address these issues, to deal with these subjects. And I think that the better we are at looking at the Scripture with the goal in mind being to find out what it says, regardless of what I need to correct, then we can look at it better, to approach the Bible with humility, not necessarily taking what everybody says, but bringing into consideration the understanding, and I say the reality, that there are things we simply just don't know yet. We have to grow in knowledge and discernment, and so we need to give ourselves ample opportunity to do so. And that means covering subjects that would be deemed very either controversial or tricky, or even what some might think to be inconsequential. But today we'll be dealing with the rapture. And when we deal with the rapture, we will be stepping on toes, but my goal is not to step on toes. My goal is to take the issue at hand as we understand it and kind of look at it, pick it apart, open up, as it were, the question of the rapture, see what it's made of, see why people reach certain conclusions, and then try to see if they hold up to scrutiny. I will preface this as well by saying that for a time I also held the position of a pre-tribulation rapture. And so I don't speak simply from the perspective of attacking. I speak from the perspective of understanding what my issues were with the subject and how it was that I decided to change my point of view on it. And perhaps it's not as complicated as some might think. I dare argue that it's actually much simpler than a lot of people believe. I'm also not going to be dealing with other eschatological issues that happen to intersect with this point, the questions of the millennium. I will immediately put it out there that I consider myself a premillennial, dispensational to a certain extent. And so that does not mean that those points can't be argued. It just means that that's not what the purpose of this video is for. I am here to deal with the question of the rapture. And so to set this kind of in position, we have two hypothetical premillennials sitting down at a table in a room discussing the rapture. And that is the context from which I will be addressing this issue. Now, before we need to address the rapture, we need to simply understand terminology here. So first question of the day, what is the rapture? A lot of people, when they hear the term rapture, they immediately think, movies like Left Behind, Kirk Cameron, and there's a newer one that I don't know if anybody bothered to watch, I unfortunately did, and came away realizing they put even less effort than the production Kirk Cameron starred in so infamously. But a lot of people, when they hear terms like the rapture, the second coming, they kind of picture our Left Behind scenario. You got a bunch of clothes all of a sudden sitting there where people used to be, bus crashes and plane crashes and chaos all of a sudden, because a whole bunch of people, some argue millions and millions of people, have suddenly disappeared in the flash, and we don't know where they went, and people are in a panic, and it seems all the Christians are gone. And this is a lot of what people think when they think of the tribulation and the rapture and the end of the age. But a couple things you need to understand is that a lot of people don't necessarily know where we get this from. If you were to pull aside your average premillennialist, your Baptist who holds to a premillennial view and the pre-tribulation view, and you handed them a Bible and said, okay, where do we find this? I don't know that a lot of them would necessarily know where to go. We have basic starting points, but a lot of them don't really understand why we have this conclusion, just that we do have this conclusion. I am a premillennialist Baptist, therefore I believe, and we immediately spout off the theological talking points. So you need to understand that a lot of people you're going to talk to about this subject just don't understand what they're actually talking about. And I don't mean that to discredit them. I mean that to point out the problem. You need to understand where they're coming from, that they simply just don't know why they hold to this position. And I think that's a side effect of most people putting eschatology at the bottom of their list of priorities. It's neat. It's fun to dabble and think about, but it's not something we view to be an absolute necessity. So when you ask them questions that pertain to eschatology, or the study of the end, kind of the deer in the headlights look start showing up. Others will understand, and they will immediately run to certain texts or certain concepts to speak of the rapture and its timing and the things around it with full authority, but in so doing, they reveal that they also haven't spent a lot of time on the texts. They're simply parroting what they've heard from other people and what they've read in other books. So we're going to approach the subject more from a casual style. We're going to approach this question of the rapture, its timing, what is it, what do people believe about it, and how can we look at this a little differently? And I know people are afraid to take the subject of the rapture and look at it differently because it sounds like I'm now a false teacher coming in like the devil on my shoulder and telling you need to question everything. That's not my point. My point is that if we have a point of theology and we spout it off with certainty, but we don't actually know where we're getting it from, then it bears looking into. I think we take certain things for granted and just don't ever bother to validate them for ourselves. And at some point or another, I think it would be dishonest to deny that this ever happens. At some point, we end up having to think for ourselves, why do I think this way? Things come along and poke holes in it and challenge it, and we struggle to answer, and this kind of falls apart, and we don't know why we hold to this position. So it is very important that we actually understand why we believe what we believe and where we can find it, and find it for ourselves. Not simply parrot things other people have said, but actually do as, say, the church in Berea, and validate whether or not the Scripture says these things. Now, speaking of the Scripture saying things, let's take that term rapture. If you go to a Bible website and you search the word rapture, you will come up empty-handed, unless your Bible translation puts it in as a header. The word rapture does not distinctly appear in the Bible, but the concept of the rapture does. So the word rapture is not appearing in the Bible, but you will find phrases that the rapture is speaking of. So rapture basically has the idea of catching something up, gathering something together. And so when we talk about the gathering together of the elect from the four corners of the earth, or the saints being caught up or taken up to meet Christ in the air, that is the idea of the rapture. But I bring this up because we don't want to be so caught up in a particular title of a theological view that we never actually open up that concept of rapture and figure out what it's made of. So just get that out of the way. The rapture is simply speaking of the event at which Christ comes and gathers the elect and brings them to be with him. And I don't think many people in the premillennialist view would disagree with that assessment. That's generally what the rapture is talking about. So when we discuss debating the rapture, we're not talking about necessarily whether or not the rapture happens. So then comes the question, all right, what's the debate over? And again, I want to re-emphasize, I am not going to be getting into all of the things that happen to string off of this particular subject. I will not be discussing premillennialism versus amillennialism versus postmillennialism. I really am not going to be addressing the mid-trib view just because I think it falls into the same pitfalls as we're going to be addressing today. And on top of the fact I just have limited time, and I will deal with the more popular of the rapture views. So I'm a premillennialist sitting down with another premillennialist, and we are discussing the rapture, and we're going to debate the rapture. So then the question is begged, we'll debate about what? And you can summarize it simply as we are not debating if the rapture will happen. We are debating when the rapture will happen. So we need to really narrow this down to what the question is. We're not debating the existence of the rapture, we're debating the timing of it. But before you can really discuss the timing of the rapture and even the event itself, you need to discuss its context. Because when you say things like pre or post-tribulation rapture, well, what's the tribulation, right? What is this thing preceding or following? What is the context surrounding this event? You will never find a epistle starting with, all right, let's talk about the rapture. It leads to it, it addresses it, it discusses it, but within a context of a broader issue. So first we're going to talk about what is often called the tribulation period. And you may have heard this term before. If you are in any way dabbling in premillennial eschatology, you have no doubt heard the 7-year tribulation. And this is important, and we'll get to that in a minute, but really discussing the 7-year tribulation as a concept. So what I'm going to do in this first part here is kind of show a premillennial, pre-tribulation view of the day of the Lord and the end times, generally speaking. And again, this is a very simple overview. This is not meant to be thorough. It's simply meant to show concepts and discuss text surrounding those concepts. So we will start with the viewpoint. And to do that, I've actually put together a little chart here. So I think this is a very simplistic version of what they believe the end of the age will look like. Excuse me while I move around here. I have a hard time sitting still. Anyway, we're dealing with the day of the Lord. And what is the day of the Lord? What does this consist of? And the general idea behind the day of the Lord is that this is his day. We're not directly speaking of a 24-hour day as much as we are speaking of his day versus man's day. The Lord is finally coming and is going to reign on the earth in 1,000 years for a kingdom, and it's going to dominate the world, and so now this is his. There's no man governments, there's now God government, theocracy, if you will. And so we're dealing with the day of the Lord and the question there. Now, the basis upon which we discuss the rest of this is going to revolve around the title, the tribulation. And this is a term that is kind of broken down. We'll see it a little later. It's kind of brought up from Matthew 24. There will be tribulation in those days, among other texts. Again, we could spend a lot of time on that, but we'll move on. So the idea is that at the very beginning, if you want to know where we get a 7-year tribulation, it's based largely out of Daniel chapter 9. And the idea or the concept drawn together as a whole, if you were to take all the different points of view and put them together, the idea is at our starting point right over here, the Antichrist makes a covenant, or he makes a deal. And they believe he makes a deal with Israel. And he makes this deal for approximately 7 years. And this 7-year period they call the tribulation. And so everything that is encompassed in this whole time is the tribulation. It's a 7-year period. You get the idea. So they believe that the Antichrist at the beginning will set up this 7-year covenant, and it kicks off the 7-year tribulation. And during this time, we find lots of things happening. And so to kind of illustrate this point, we'll back out of here just for a quick second, and we're going to make our way over to Matthew chapter 24. And a lot of the idea comes from terminology that's being used. So we'll start over here at verse 4. Jesus answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See to it that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. And then they will deliver you to tribulation." And this whole one word here, not the whole sentence. So if we're dealing with tribulation here, we're now starting to enter into this first period that we so lovingly call our 7-year tribulation. So we move on. They deliver you over to tribulation. You will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and mislead many, because lawlessness is increased. Most people's love will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. The gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all of the nations, and then the end will come. And this is viewed as the gospel being preached not just by saints, but by an angel flying amid heaven. You have 144,000, the 2 witnesses. The gospel is being preached all over the place. And then we move into verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are out of his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter, nor on the Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation. So, the key things we're going to take note of here are great tribulation, and then we have the regular tribulation. And they make a distinct difference between these two things. So going back to our chart here, we have our regular tribulation here, and then our great tribulation here. And in the middle of this 7-year covenant, the Antichrist sets up his abomination of desolation right in the middle, and that kicks off, per Matthew 24, our great tribulation. We have our abomination of desolation, spoken of through Daniel the prophet. There's where we will tie back to Daniel chapter 9. He makes a covenant with the many for 1 week of years, or 7 years. And in the middle, he puts a stop to it, and the abomination of desolation sets up, which kicks off our great tribulation. So that's kind of a very basic overview, right? And so if the great tribulation kicks off at the halfway point of a 7-year covenant, then it stands to reason that the great tribulation is 3.5 years. And I will say I don't really have a problem with that assessment. So what about the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets and the bowls of wrath that are brought up in Revelation? Well, they would say that those things are kind of scattered throughout this whole 7-year period. That throughout this 7-year tribulation, and more particularly within the Great Tribulation, the latter half of it, those things start really raining down, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And at the end of this 7-year tribulation, Jesus comes back, and it's all over. It begins as 1,000-year reign, and we move on into the millennium. So that's a general breakdown of the general eschatology of the average premillennialist. Now comes the question of the rapture, and as you can see here, they put it firmly at the beginning, right? That prior to all of these things that Jesus is talking about, the church will be taken up into heaven and will not undergo the time period of the tribulation. So then you might ask questions, well, like, okay, well, who are these saints that are being caught up then at the end of it? Who are these people that are clearly seen being saved throughout the tribulation? And they give them the lovely title of the Tribulation Saints. So it's a general overview of what a pre-trib, premillennialist view of the day of the Lord looks like. And I will point out that they view the day of the Lord to be pertaining to all of these things, and that the rapture is what happens before the day of the Lord and kicks off the day of the Lord. So, the debate goes, as I said earlier, back to the timing of the rapture. When does it occur? If I were sitting at a table with a pre-trib rapture individual, or one who believes in the pre-tribulation rapture, then we will be discussing the timing of that event, the rapture. But not just that. So, going over a quick couple points, if there is a period called the tribulation, which is 7 years, which includes the Great Tribulation halfway through it, then the position of a pre-tribulation rapture believes that the church is caught up by Jesus before the 7-year period begins, and so thus we get our term pre-tribulation. Before the tribulation, the church is raptured, is the argument. By implication, this does mean that they believe, in some way or another, Jesus sort of comes back twice, right? We have him appearing at the rapture, but also the second coming. This second coming at the end of the day of the Lord is not the same thing as the rapture. That's different. Before the end begins, Jesus appears in the sky. He calls the saints to be up with him, and then goes back into heaven while the tribulation begins. He then returns fully after a 7-year tribulation ends and appears with those saints previously raptured. For context, they would also put the time of the resurrection of the saints at the rapture here as well. Now that we've kind of laid out what I think is a fairly basic, but I think fair overview of the belief, especially since I was in this camp, so I'm familiar with it. Now we're going to start looking at the textual basis, so you can understand the idea here. But you're going to start asking questions, because if you go into Matthew 24, or if you go into Daniel chapter 9, or Daniel 11 and 12, it's not going to seem this clear cut. We're going to have questions about it. So for example, Daniel chapter 9, where we have our 7-year covenant, Daniel doesn't call it a tribulation. So you're going to start asking questions like, well, where do we get this from, right? Show me a text that says that it's this way. And I guarantee, and I think out of necessity, the pre-tribulation rapture proponent is going to have to run to one place in particular before any other place. This is the foundation. This is the place where they would make their stand, and that's 1 Thessalonians 4 through 5. If they can't hold this, then the rest of it starts to fall apart. So the argument's going to be revolving around this text, because if you had read Matthew 24 on its own and Daniel 9 on its own and so on, you wouldn't naturally reach this view of the end. You would reach something somewhat similar, but as for the timing of the rapture, you're just not going to land there, not naturally. So the argument with 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5 is going to be the layout here. So they're going to argue that 1 Thessalonians 4 is addressing the Thessalonians regarding the subject of the rapture, and they're going to say that, well, okay, these people, they're concerned, right? In verse 13, Paul says that we don't want you to be unaware or uninformed, brethren, that those who are asleep, those who are already dead, that you don't grieve as do the rest who have no hope. For, verse 14, if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore comfort one another with these words. Now there's a few key points in this section, particularly here, that they're going to really harp on to make the case. That's going to be things like, we notice how he doesn't deal with judgment, right? Paul isn't talking about the judgment of God. He's not talking about the tribulation and the great tribulation and judging the world and the bowls and the trumpets and all that stuff. They're arguing that, well, this is simply talking about getting those saints out of there. And so you would look at phrases like, we're meeting the Lord in the air, we will always be with him, comfort one another with these words, right? Comfort, that's going to be a key word that they're really going to harp on here, right? It needs to be something that comforts people. Now, the issue is going to be that they're really going to raise up, well, I could argue against this and say, well, yeah, but he doesn't say that precedes the tribulation. And they'll say, but this is 1 Thessalonians 4. You need to move over to the next chapter, 1 Thessalonians 5. We need to make our way over and look at where Paul was going with this. So, okay, we've just talked about Jesus coming, and for comfort, he's going to take the saints and gather them up in the air so that they will always be with him. Notice, he's gathering them in the air, though. And so if he's gathering them in the air, it doesn't say he touches down on the earth. It doesn't completely follow through. And now Paul changes subjects, right? He uses these words here. Now, as to, or he's transitioning the topic. He's transitioning the subject. We're moving on to something else, right? So the church has already been caught up here in chapter 4. So now he's going to move on to something else. That must mean something else follows it. That's their conclusion. So he then talks about the times and the epochs. So you could say the signs of the times. And that they have no need of anything to be written, for you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. And so they're going to really argue that 1 Thessalonians 4, Jesus coming and gathering the saints together, here we have this. Now Paul's moving on to discuss the rest of it, the day of the Lord, the tribulation, and the great tribulation. And so they're really going to harp on the layout. 1 Thessalonians 4 precedes 1 Thessalonians 5. He's dealing with the church being gathered together. Now he's going to talk about the day of the Lord. See, these are two distinct things. Is what they will argue. And then we carry on, and the other key point they're really going to argue is this section right here. And what they're going to argue is that we are not in the darkness, right? The day is not going to overtake us like a thief, for we are all sons of light and sons of day. We are not of night nor of the darkness. So then let us not sleep as others do, but let us be alert and sober. For those who do their sleeping or sleep at night, and those who get drunk at night. But since we are of the day, right, we're not of the darkness, we're of the light, we're of the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet the hope of salvation. For God has not destined us for wrath. And this is going to be the thing that they're really going to hinge it off of. That God has not destined us for wrath, right? The day of the Lord is a day of wrath. God has not destined us for that. With the saints, we don't have to be worried about that day. And so we'll go back to chapter 4 and say, see, he's caught us up. We're not there. And this is why, because God hasn't destined us for wrath. And so he's saved us by means of catching us up out before the tribulation begins. And on top of that, again, encourage one another. It needs to be encouraging. And the idea of going through the tribulation is simply not an encouraging thing. So why would you tell them you're going through the tribulation? That's not encouraging. You can't comfort each other with this. That's going to be a lot of where the argument's going to come from. This is 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5. Now, there's a lot more that I'm sure they would say about this, and they would run to other texts to add to this. But that's a pretty basic overview of how they would break apart these two chapters and these points. And from this, everything else is going to kind of derive itself. They're going to move into other subjects and say, based on this, we can now look at Matthew 24 and Daniel chapter 9 and Revelation and so on, and have this position of a pre-tribulation rapture. Other things, other texts that they would use as defenses or interpretation, I would categorize more as incidental interpretations. They believe that the church isn't seen, or since the church isn't seen throughout most of Revelation, that must mean that the church is not on the earth at the time of the tribulation. So after Revelation chapter 5, from 6 on, you really don't see the church there, and so that must mean they aren't present, right? But again, that's more of an incidental. That's kind of something that is deduced from a presuppositional view of the text. Revelation doesn't say the church isn't there, it just carries on. So that would be more incidental. They believe that the 24 elders that are seen in Revelation 4 and 5 represent the church being in heaven after the rapture. So Revelation's about to get into the day of the Lord and the judgments and all that fun stuff, but here's the church already there. See, they must have been taken up beforehand. And a lot of these things, again, are kind of incidental arguments. I could argue them, but I don't think that's really the key issue. I think those are simply consequences of a different interpretation of a different text. And so they look at 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, and they draw up a conclusion for a pre-tribulation rapture, and from that spring their interpretation of other texts. So I really wanted to go at the heart of the issue here to kind of give a basis for why they view the things the way they do. And so when you look at this chart, recognize that a lot of this, especially this here, comes from the idea of a pre-tribulation rapture. We will deal with 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5 in just a minute here. But the other thing that really needs to be addressed, or at least brought up to clarify, because there's one other point they're going to argue. They're not just going to talk about 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5. They are going to argue for the doctrine of what is called imminency. The idea that at any moment, at any day, without warning, without sign, Jesus will come back. And this has quite a few textual bases that they will run to. So, for example, the one that we just read in 1 Thessalonians 5, right? You know that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. It will come upon them suddenly like a woman in labor. So that's going to be one of them. The other is going to be found in Matthew 24. Right? Of the day and hour nobody knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like in the days of Noah. Right? It's sudden, it's fast, nobody sees it coming, it's unexpected. And then towards the end of that section there will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and another one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and another left. See, there's the rapture. The day of the Lord is coming quickly, he's coming very fast, and there's the idea. And then carrying on in verse 24, right, be on the alert. You don't know when the Lord is coming. If the head of the house had known when the master or when the thief was coming, he would have prepared. You don't know when he's coming, so you must be ready, for the Son of Man will come in an hour when you don't think that he will. So the idea is, this is right, he's coming, he's right at the door, you don't know, it's going to be at any moment, you're running in parallel with the return of Christ. And then finally, and perhaps one of the most oft-quoted ones, in 1 Corinthians 15, I tell you a mystery, we will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in the moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. So, in the twinkling of an eye, in an instant, Christ is going to appear suddenly, without warning, without any sort of precursor, any kind of sign, and thus we have our doctrine of imminency, that in an instant Christ must appear. And the moment you start bringing in questions to that, you now begun to question the idea of imminency, and therefore you're now way out of base, and we're going to start having problems with you. Now we're going to get to the counter-argument, though. So I think we spent a fair amount of time kind of breaking down the idea of how their view is structured, how they come up with the conclusions that they do. There's obviously more places they can go, but for the sake of what I'm about to do, this is a good starting point. So let's start with the counter-arguments. How do you approach this? Because you could go to any one of these verses or chapters that they're referencing and the charts that they've drawn up and kind of poke holes in it. But I think the first thing we need to do is point out an obvious fact. If you ever sit down with somebody who's going to defend a pre-tribulation rapture, you're going to find them doing something consistently. They'll have their Bible out and they will be all over the place. They will be flying from 1 Thessalonians 4, they'll make their way back to Matthew 24, then to Daniel chapter 9, then they're going to run back over to 2 Thessalonians, then Revelation, and they're going to be just all over the place. They have a very hard time staying in any one text. And the reason for that is because at a base level, there is no one text that says what they're saying. There is no text that says there is a 7-year tribulation and before it the church will be taken out and brought into heaven. There's no one text that says it. They will say that texts lead you to that conclusion. They will show you texts that imply it, but there's no text that directly states that. The other issue they're going to run into, and I might harp on this again a little bit, is the idea of the tribulation. See, if you go back to Matthew 24 that we looked at earlier, and you take that section where he mentions tribulation, he doesn't say, then they will deliver you and the tribulation will begin. He doesn't say that. The word tribulation is, again, more of an incidental usage here. He's describing something. He's not giving a title to something. You will be delivered to tribulation, or to a trial, to something that will try you. And again, they will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name, right? That's tribulation. He's describing this for them, for you, for, to some extent or another, believers. And you can argue, and some of it applies to Israel, but I think the immediate context demands you, because of my name is what he's basing this off of. So those who follow his name will be hated by all nations. And then he carries on into other things. So this use of the term tribulation is tied by a presuppositional view. In other words, they have determined that this 7-year period in Daniel 9, that's the 7-year period, so now we're going to slap the title tribulation so we can then line it up with great tribulation down here. But let's go to Daniel 9. Let's take a look at what this text actually covers. So Daniel chapter 9 is where we get what's called the 70 weeks, right? You have 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, make an end of sin, make atonement for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. And so there's a lot of discussion that can be had on this section, and that would be another video for another time. The key part we're going to really deal with here is the last week. This is the section that they are really basing this idea of, at least in part, their 7 years from. And I agree that the last week, right, the 1 week here, is referring to 7 years. And there's an explanation for that. Again, another video, another time. But let's say for the sake of this argument here, that when he's talking about weeks, he's talking about a week of 7 years, or one week, which is equivalent to 7 years. So let's start with this spot right here. And he. Who is he? Right, you would assume that it's the Antichrist because that's what they've determined. The only problem with that is that the term Antichrist is not used here. In fact, it's not used in many places. You don't really find the title Antichrist until you really start making your way into John's epistles. You will find inferences to the man of lawlessness, the little horn, the king from the north. You'll find different titles for an impending bad guy, but he's not directly brought up here. And so I think there's a fair bit of discussion still to be had with who the he is that's making a firm covenant. So I don't think that this directly translates to Antichrist, because I think you really have a tricky time kind of documenting that, because there is no other text that's describing the man of lawlessness, the little horn, the king from the north, the Antichrist, whatever title you want to give him in that context. There's no title, there's no section using that title that describes him making a 7-year agreement. your 7-year period is predominantly going to be drawn from this spot here. And notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say directly who he is. You could argue that maybe it's this guy up here, the prince who is to come, because it's his people who destroy the city after Messiah is cut off. The people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. So some argue that it's likely referring to him, and he will make a firm covenant. And there's discussion to be had down that line, but we won't go down that rabbit trail. Right? So it doesn't necessarily say who he is, but what's he doing? Well, let's say it is the Antichrist for the sake of their argument. Well, it says he makes a firm covenant. What does this covenant consist of? Well, it doesn't say. Right? Daniel 9 seems to leave the subject kind of vacant. He will make a firm covenant. Doesn't describe it, just says it is a firm covenant. The only qualifier he gives is that it will last for 1 week. Right? So it's a 7-year covenant. In the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And then on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until the complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So my point with that, to kind of fly over it, is that it really doesn't give a lot of detail. It doesn't say what the firm covenant is, doesn't really specify who he is, just that a male is coming, an individual man, and he will make a covenant, a firm one. It's well established. It's a decent covenant. It's not some willy-nilly thing that's going to be all over the place. It's a very distinct one. He makes it with the many for 1 week. And there's another question. Who are the many? Right? You often hear that this is a covenant with Israel. And I think that's fair speculation, but you can't be dogmatic on that because it doesn't say he will make a firm covenant with your people or with Israel or with Jacob. He doesn't use any of those titles. It just says the many. So the simple conclusion is it's a group of people. It's a distinct group of people. It's not just everybody. It is the many, but it doesn't say who they are. So he, whoever he is, will make a firm covenant, whatever that is, with the many, whoever they are, for 1 week. So you just start going through it. Okay, we have some specifics. You can deduce that in this covenant, the subject of sacrifice and grain offering are involved because it is marked in the middle of it that he puts a stop to these two things. So you can speculate there, but you can't be too dogmatic on it because the text isn't. So then comes the question. What's the point of it then? Why is he being so vague? Why be so generic if we're not going to describe what it is? Well, we got to get back to the overall context. Why was any of this being brought up? If you go through the rest of Daniel 9, you're going to see Daniel is praying, and he goes on this long discussion about how we have sinned against him, that is God, and this is in the context of them waiting to be restored out of Babylon. Right? They've been led into Babylonian captivity. You have your story of Nebuchadnezzar. You have Daniel himself being involved with that story in the lion's den and all that fun stuff. And so that's the context, right? He's describing their plight, their sin, that they've rebelled against God, and he's looking for forgiveness, and he knows that it's been said that they would be freed out of Babylon. So this is the context of his prayer. He's admitting they're wrong. He's pointing to God for the solution, just as they brought your people out of the land of Egypt. Right? He's discussing Israel's redemption. And he concludes it with, O Lord, hear, O Lord, forgive, O Lord, listen and take action. That's what he's asking for. He's asking for him to restore his city and his people who are called by your name. Now we move on to the next section. After he's been praying this prayer, Gabriel shows up and he gives him an answer. And he goes on, he just proceeds to describe, I've been sent out while I was still speaking in prayer, then the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in my vision previously, came to me in my extreme weariness about the time of the evening offering, and he gave me instruction and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I have come forth to give you insight with understanding. Insight with understanding for what? Well, his request, Israel's redemption. At the beginning of your supplications, the command was issued, and I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed, so give heed to the message and gain understanding of the vision. So, there's a lot to unpack in this, and again, we don't have a lot of time to go over it, so I'll kind of fly over it briefly. But the idea is Daniel's dealing with the subject of Israel's sin and God redeeming them, God bringing them out of their sin, God saving them. Right? That's Daniel's concern. He's calling for God to take action to fulfill what he had said through Jeremiah that he would do. He would save Israel. Gabriel shows up and says, the moment you were talking about it, the command was issued, I've come out, I'm going to give you an answer, I'm going to give you understanding. But the answer that's given supersedes or begins to go well beyond just Israel's captivity, because now we're moving into the subject of Messiah. We're dealing with More importantly, I would say, and far more importantly than their redemption from Babylon, a very important list. We quoted it earlier. 70 weeks have been decreed, right? This is the answer to the issue you're bringing up. This is the decree. So we're giving 70 weeks for your people and for your holy city. Now, you can argue, okay, well, what are those weeks? And again, as I mentioned earlier, for the sake of this topic, for the sake of this time limitation, a week is 7 years, so 70 weeks is 70 weeks of, or 70 groups of sevens is the literal interpretation of it. If you look even in the Greek and the Hebrew, weeks is more of an English word that's been applied here. It really just means 70 sevens. The idea is you have groups of 7, and there are 70 of those sevens. Within the context, especially dealing with Messiah, we understand those to be referencing years, not simply days, and the term days isn't directly used here. So we have 70 sevens, or 70 groups of sevens, and we know those to be years, and these have been decreed for your people, right? So this pertains specifically to Israel, for your holy city, Jerusalem, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. That's a lot of stuff. That goes well beyond Babylonian captivity, and we know after Israel left Babylon, a lot of these things did not happen. Most, I would dare argue, all of these things did not happen, because Jesus had yet to come, and even then, they would still crucify him, as was to be pointed out here. Messiah, the prince, shows up, and he gets cut off. So this is the context of the 70 weeks. This is the whole basis of it. So now we'll go back down to our verse 27. So why is it being so vague? Why won't it directly define who he is that's making whatever the covenant is with whoever the many are? Why is he so vague? Because the question isn't, the answer isn't to the question, what exactly is the last week? The answer is to simply show where it's going to be. That here's a last week. This is the last thing, especially from our point of view, because from Daniel's, Messiah hadn't come yet. He hadn't been cut off yet. That hadn't occurred yet. We know Messiah has come. Messiah did get cut off. He did ascend back into heaven, and now we're waiting for him to come back. So that's one of the reasons why we know this remains to be yet future. So the reason it remains vague is because it wasn't directly addressing who he is or what the covenant would be or what it would be about or who the many are. You can, I think, safely assume that maybe the many is referring to Israel because the context is your holy, or your people in your holy city. But really the key emphasis of this last verse here is to explain what the last week was, that there would be 7 years left, and in that he gives a series of things that would happen. Someone is going to make a firm covenant with many, maybe Israel, for 1 year, or one series of 7 years. We don't know what it consists of, but it's going to happen. And in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And that's important because that is referenced in Daniel chapter 8. Again, another video for another time, but it's worth looking into that section of Daniel 8 and trying to reverse engineer that and try to figure out why those two are linked. So this is more to deal with the rest of Daniel's prophecies. And by the way, that is what Gabriel said. He's going to give heed to the message and gain understanding of the vision. And this is the same Gabriel whom he had seen before, as mentioned here. So this isn't just an isolated incident. This is tied to everything else Daniel's already been looking at here. This is Daniel 9, so if you go back to Daniel 8, you're going to see sacrifice and grain offering mentioned there. Along with, on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. Your abomination of desolation is being alluded to in this section. That's what is being discussed here. And there's something that is decreed that is poured out on the one who makes desolate. The overall context, this is a very, very short thing right here. This is not terribly detailed. And it's not meant to be terribly detailed. It's more meant to be glue that holds other details together, to make sense of other sections of Daniel's prophecy. That's the purpose of this. Now, if you'll notice, why am I going on this long tangent explaining Daniel chapter 9? Well, tribulation isn't mentioned here. He does not say there is a 7-year tribulation. He doesn't mention anything about the rapture, and I don't think a lot of people think he would, but he doesn't. And so you really need to understand what the purpose of this text is. So the moment you take a simple thing like he makes a covenant with the many for 1 week and turn that into an entire period of time, giving it a label that Jesus incidentally uses as a description, they will deliver you to tribulation. Now, he doesn't say the tribulation as referenced through Daniel. He doesn't do that. So we take a description of an event, turn it into a title, then go back to Daniel chapter 9, take 7 years, turn it into the entire tribulation, and put the Antichrist at the beginning of it. Right? So my whole argument with this whole thing is that this whole idea of a 7-year tribulation is itself not found in any one text. You have to really go hop, skip, and jump at least between 2 or 3 places to even try to make that argument. And even then, the title, The Tribulation, isn't expressly used anywhere. So what you're arguing for when you argue for a rapture, a pre-tribulation rapture, is the church being caught up into heaven, not being on the earth anymore, prior to a 7-year tribulation period, that you really have a hard time finding the exact textual basis for this. So that's already going to be an issue there, right? So that's just Daniel chapter 9. Let's make our way over, speaking of Matthew 24, to that lovely text. All right, so surely Jesus must bring up the rapture here, right? Surely he must deal with the subject of a 7-year tribulation. So we've already dealt with this, right? He's not expressly calling a time period the tribulation. That's a title that's been manufactured, and I don't mean that nefariously. I simply mean it's been a title that was made up. It was a title that was used, just like the term rapture. That doesn't disqualify it. That simply means that it's an extra-biblical idea. We're using it as a box to hold the text in for our conclusion. But let's actually look at the context here, right? Why is any of this being brought up? So you see the disciples, as they come out of the temple, the disciples point to the buildings, look at these things, great, and Jesus is discussing that this temple will be destroyed, and we know that did happen. But then the disciples, as he's sitting on the Mount of Olives, come to him privately, and they start asking him, okay, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming? And this is the important part, right? We're dealing with the sign of your coming and the end of the age. And so this is the context, this is the question Jesus is answering. And so much like in Daniel 9, it's not simply addressing the immediate issue, Israel in Babylonian captivity, or the destruction of the temple. The disciples asked the question for an entire range of questions, or an entire range of time. The whole subject of the end of the age and the sign of your coming, which is interesting that they would even bring up this question of his coming, seeing as he was sitting with them on the Mount of Olives. So even they seem to conclude that he had yet to come in his kingdom. So that's the context of what he's dealing with here. Now he proceeds to move on and he describes wars and rumors of wars. I'm going to really fly through this for the limitation of time and not wanting to get down rabbit trails. But wars, rumors of wars, don't be frightened. This is not yet the end. Nation rises against nation, kingdom against kingdom, in various places, famines and earthquakes. These things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. We recognize birth pangs being used here as an eschatological picture, that a woman being in labor is the idea. So as you have contractions, they increasingly get worse and worse. And the idea is that they are trying to get to the point of having the baby in question. So then the baby in question is the end of the age and the second coming and so on. And so he says these things, wars and rumors of wars and nations rising against nations and famines and earthquakes, these are just the beginning. These are like the little blips on the contraction machine that's showing it's happening, but this is just the beginning. These aren't the big ones yet. Then he moves it up another notch. They deliver you to tribulation and will kill you. So now we're getting into the subject of persecution. They will take believers, either in Israel or in general. I would argue it would be more in general, because we're dealing with the context of his name being the basis of being hated by all the nations. So they will deliver the saints to tribulation and will kill you when you will be hated by all nations because of my name. Then he moves on, right? He's dealing with the saints. At that time, many will fall away. Right? What does the term fall away tie to? We have the word apostasy. Many will fall away. Many will apostatize. Many will just kind of drift away. And when we're dealing with in the context here, we're dealing with the saints. So in the end, as you're seeing these smaller contractions of eschatology occurring, recognize that in the same time frame, they will kill you and they will hate you because of my name, and many of you are going to quit, as it were. Many people who claim to be Christians will fall away, and they will betray one another, and they will hate one another. And in that, many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. And because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. The gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all of the nations, and then the end will come. So it is an increasing thing, like contractions do. It is growing in severity, but he's also dealing with the persecution of the saints. Now the question comes in, well, who are these? Right? If we're dealing with tribulation, and we're going to argue that the saints have been delivered from the tribulation, why at the same time are they being delivered to tribulation and being killed and hated? And if you're going to argue that these precede the rapture, then you're going to run into other issues here, well, notwithstanding all of these other things in the immediate context here. In other words, you have to insert what I would call an artificial gap. You'd have to say that this tribulation that they're delivering you over to is a different tribulation, but still also the tribulation, and we're just going to kind of move it where we need to. And then we carry on. Then when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, and this phrase here, let the reader understand, I confidently believe is whether it's Matthew or it's Christ, either way, he's directing back to Daniel, because that's who Christ is quoting here. So Jesus is saying, go back to Daniel, understand Daniel's context. And I'll get into it in a minute, but this abomination of desolation that's being referenced by Daniel the prophet, I don't think is Daniel chapter 9. I think that's Daniel chapter 11, and we'll explain why in a minute. But when you see this abomination of desolation, you know Daniel was talking about it. So when you see that, standing in the holy place, get out of Dodge, get out of town. Those who were in Judea specifically need to flee to the mountains. Things are about to go down. So you've had your birth pangs, right? They're getting serious. The illustration then can carry on and say the abomination of desolation is like the water breaking. The moment that's happened, you've got to move fast because things are really starting to get rough. So those who were in Judea need to get out of Dodge. And he carries on, and then he says, and there will be a great tribulation. Now, notice what's missing here, right? Because he carries on that unless those days have been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days have been cut short. So that's why it's fast. If anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, don't believe him. False Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Right? He's warning them about these things. And the question, again, arises, if we're not here, why bring this up? Well, because we're raptured. Well, where's the rapture? Right? You can't find it here. And last I checked, the only time you see in this whole context of the Son of Man appearing to the sky is after all of these things. Because immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of the sky with great power and glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. So in a natural flow of thought, without any breaks or artificial gaps, you would conclude, based off Matthew 24, that the rapture, the gathering together of his elect from the four winds, is after the Great Tribulation. That's what you would be forced to assume. Even if you're going to argue that there is a 7-year period of tribulation, this implies that after that, you will be gathered together. So either there are two raptures now, or you've artificially added one of them. So that's Matthew 24. If we run over to Daniel chapter 11, there's a lot to be said about this text, but I'm just going to quickly go over one specific point. If you remember, Jesus said, referencing the abomination of desolation as spoken of through Daniel the prophet, well, here we can find an abomination of desolation. So, looking through Daniel 11, there's a series of kings, one after the other, showing up on the scene, and we finally get to our last king, the king of the north. And I think it would be extremely hard to debate, especially from a premillennial disposition, that this is anybody but the last king. The things that he proceeds to do, as far as the Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, the things that he does are very particular and very much easily linked to other texts. But again, another subject for another time. The key point is here we're describing this last king. And he says, or in verse 31, forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. The same incident, getting away of the regular sacrifice, as we see in Daniel 8 and Daniel 9. So they will do away with those, and then they will set up the abomination of desolation. So there we see it again. And we carry on, and this king's doing a lot of different things. And in verse 36, he does as he pleases, and he exalts and magnifies himself above every god, and speaks monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. And you might find that that sounds very familiar if you're looking back to Daniel chapter 9. We're dealing with the subject of the 70 weeks. Right? What does it say at the end? And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So it's implying that it's a designated period of time that this is allowed to happen. So this king continues doing what he does, and there's a lot of things that he does between the different kings of other nations. And then in Daniel chapter 12, at the first verse, at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress. Another synonymous word would be the word tribulation, such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. So we're dealing with a great tribulation, a time of great distress. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. There's a resurrection of the dead following the tribulation, the time of distress, the great tribulation. So logically, if you follow this whole chart through and you go back to it, putting the gathering together of the elect, putting the resurrection of the dead here just doesn't make a lot of sense from any of those texts. So when they run to places like 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, which is where a lot of this is hinged off of, they have to do that because they can't hang out in these texts too long. So let's take a look at 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5. Why is Paul dealing with this subject? Because again, they're going to argue, well, the layout, right? You have Christ coming and gathering together the elect, and that's to comfort them. Now, the first thing I would challenge with that interpretation of chapter 4 is the other place we find the gathering together of the elect is there in Matthew 24, and that's following the Great Tribulation. So there's a problem there. But they would say, well, look, he's dealing with this, and then he moves on to chapter 5. Moves on like it's a future event after this. Now, I think any person who is honest with themselves can understand that's not a foolproof argument. Paul changing subjects, moving on to another subject, does not mean that the subject that's following is chronologically one which follows the one previously discussed. Again, you'd have to apply a presuppositional view of the events being discussed in order to reach that conclusion. The other thing they're going to bring up as well, how is it comforting to say you would go through the tribulation? And to be honest, I think that is one of the weakest arguments that could ever be made, because we don't define comfort by not going through bad things. Often comfort comes by having to go through them. And on top of the fact that when you're going to argue what I would call a consequential method of interpretation, well, if what you're saying is true, then that means, and then we argue an extra biblical point, that does not interpret the text. Maybe we should conclude that if he's talking about us going through the tribulation, but also being comforted, maybe the comfort isn't being taken out of it. Maybe the comfort is to be found going through it. And then they'll say, well, then you're saying that we're going to be subject to the wrath of God. Right? Because that's what the tribulation is. That's what the day of the Lord is the day of God's wrath. To which I would point out that, one, him saying we are not of the darkness, we are not of the night, does not mean that we're taken off the planet into heaven. That's not what it means. And I would never be led to assume that God is so inaccurate with his wrath that he has to kind of throw it at the whole canvas and whoever gets hit, gets hit. God knows exactly what he's doing in his judgment and is very precise in his targeting. If you recall, when he was judging Egypt with massive plagues, Israel wasn't far away, and they weren't taken out of Egypt to be spared from that, much less were they taken out of the planet. They were there. God just selected who he was going to go after. So I think there's a very weak argument in saying things like, well, I don't think that's comforting. That does not mean the interpretation is wrong. It just means your definition or your interpretation of comfort is wrong and needs to be adjusted. God comforts many going through tribulation. We go through the valley of the shadow of death and fear no evil, because God is with us whether or not we're going through bad or rough times. So it's a very weak argument. And then the last place I think they're really going to hold out is the idea of imminency. Well, you're arguing that it can't come immediately. It's a sad day. Jesus can't come back today. It's going to be a very, very sad position to hold. Again, I think that's an incidental argument. I don't think on its face that's a good one. So then they're going to run two other texts, which we'll deal with here in a minute. But let's take, okay, what does 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5 actually say? Right? It's easy to poke holes in other people's arguments, but you can't do that sufficiently or righteously in most cases without having a better answer. So if I were to say anything about how to approach this subject with someone you disagree with, don't just challenge them. Challenge them indirectly by giving a better interpretation of the text, one that is more consistent with the context. So if we go back to 1 Thessalonians 4, What was Paul talking about? What was he comforting them about? Well, verse 13, we don't want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, so that you do not grieve as the rest who have no hope. He's talking about those who have already died, right? If we're going to talk about the day of the Lord and the resurrection of the dead and the second coming of Christ, there was apparently this fear that those who had already died were going to miss it, that we wanted to be alive so that when Christ came again, we would be caught up. And these people who have died, either by means of persecution or natural causes, they're not going to get to experience that. So Paul's addressing this specific fear, this specific issue, and proceeds to go on and describe the resurrection. Verse 14, that if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, right, if Christ died and was able to come out of the dead, even so God will bring with Christ, with him, those who have fallen asleep in Christ. So those who have already died before you will be resurrected from the dead. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that those who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord. So he's bringing this up for context, right? We're going to deal with the day of the Lord. We're going to deal with the end of the age. So those of us who are alive, because that's where they were at this point, we're alive and they're not. Their concern was with those who are not alive. But he's going to give an overall picture. He's going to paint the whole picture here, right? So we know that by the word of the Lord that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord won't or will not precede those who have fallen asleep. So what he's saying here, and the reason he's bringing up the subject of them being caught up together with Christ, is to explain where the resurrection of the dead fit in with that. He's not bringing it up to create a new area of theology. He's simply explaining the context of the resurrection. That's why he's bringing this up. So when the Lord himself descends from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel and the trumpet of God, the dead in Christ will rise first. So not only do you not have to be worried about them missing the day when Christ comes again, they're going to go before you. And then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, so that we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore, comfort one another with these words. Right? What was the fear? That those who had died before, let's say your brother or your mother, someone you cared about, had died, and now you're afraid they're not going to experience the glory in the day of the Lord. The comfort with these words is, don't worry, they'll go before you because the resurrection is going to happen and then you'll be caught up. That's the context. That's what he's addressing. Then he moves on into chapter 5 and says, now as about the rest of the day of the Lord, as for all the other stuff that's going to go on, we have no need to write anything to you. You already know. I don't have to deal with that issue because you've already got that one covered. He's not saying, now we're going to move on to another subject that follows the thing previously discussed. He's simply clarifying, you already know the rest of the details. You're good when it comes to great tribulation. You're good when it comes to abomination of desolation. And as will be dealt with in 2 Thessalonians 2, we'll add on to it with things like the man of lawlessness and the apostasy. But you're good with the rest of this. For you yourselves already know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. That day of the Lord is not transitioning into a new topic. He's simply carrying on with the subject he was discussing before. Just speaking about the same thing from another point of view. And he carries on. And so then don't let it overtake you like a thief, because you will be alive and remain, so don't be caught off. And then when it comes to the subject of you not being in the darkness nor of the night, you are sons of light, you don't have to worry about the wrath of God. Right? They already knew about this. Right? We have no need to write anything to you, because you already know the things that are going to happen, the judgments that will come upon the earth. You're not in the darkness, so you don't have to worry about that. God's not targeting you. God's not going after you. You don't have to be afraid of it. And you can see echoes of this in Luke 21, where when Jesus is talking about the world looking with perplexity at the signs in the heavens, he says, but as for you, straighten up your heads. Look up. You don't have to be worried about this. Your redemption is coming. Don't be afraid of it. So you're not of the darkness. You're of your night. You can go through the tribulation with absolutely no concern for the wrath of God. It does not bother you at all, because God has not destined us for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who already died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, whether we're dead or alive, when he comes, we will live together with him. Encourage and build up one another, just as you're also doing, and he carries on. So my point with this interpretation is to show that it does not expressly state that there is a pre-tribulation rapture. It doesn't mention the tribulation at all, other than perhaps persecution by implication. So, and then carrying on to 2 Thessalonians 2 real quick, as for the day of the Lord, a lot of the things you're going to hear from a pre-trib rapture proponent is that There are no signs that precede the rapture. There's nothing, there's no warning, there's no indication, there are no signs of that particular time. Which to me is excessively ironic, because of all the categories of people who believe in different points of eschatology, last I checked, it was the pre-trib rapturists who have some of the most speculative minds imaginable, left behind not being the least among them. They are extremely involved with the signs of the times, but will on the other hand immediately turn around and say there are no signs that precede the rapture. So their exercise in looking at the signs of the times, like mark of the beast or image of the beast, is purely just academical. They have no consequence for them whatsoever, which is just an odd position to hold. So there's that, and then going into the question of the day of the Lord, we now get into 2 Thessalonians 2. And real quick, Paul's now addressing another subject. This is another book, this is another letter he's written to them after the first one. We request of you, brethren, with regard to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together with him, that's the subject he's talking about, our rapture, that you not be quickly shaken from your composure or to be disturbed either by a spirit or a message or a letter, as if from us. So concerning the question of the rapture, concerning the question of the coming of the Lord and our gathering together with him, something was challenging them. Something was shaking them. What was it? Well, at the end of verse 2, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. Now, a lot of your pre-trib proponents are going to come and say, see, they thought that they were in the day of the Lord and they were fully expecting to be taken out of it before that. That's not what he's talking about here. He's dealing with the immediate context concerning the coming of our Lord and our gathering together. He seems to tie that to the same thing as the day of the Lord. He doesn't separate the two. That is implied by some readers. But what he does say, and this is the context he's dealing with, is the day of the Lord, because they were afraid that the day of the Lord had come and they had missed it. Somebody told them it had already begun, and they're looking around saying, I don't see it. What's going on? And you can tell this because of how Paul answers the question. He doesn't say, don't worry, you'll still be raptured. You don't have to worry, there's no signs before that. He doesn't argue that. In fact, he does the opposite. He says that in verse 3, let no one in any way deceive you, for the day of the Lord will not come unless the apostasy comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, and so on. So he doesn't say, don't worry, the rapture is going to happen first. He says, don't worry, concerning the rapture, the day of the Lord, both of those things, the day of the Lord's not going to happen. None of this is going to begin. You haven't missed it until this happens, and this happens, and this happens, and he proceeds to go on and give a list. Now, if he was trying to address the subject of the rapture occurring before the day of the Lord, then why waste time going around arguing about things that they weren't going to see? The man of lawlessness being revealed, the son of destruction, and the apostasy. Why bring those up? If I said, if you were concerned that the day of the Lord was here and you were in the tribulation and you didn't think you were supposed to be there, you thought you were supposed to be caught up before the tribulation, the argument would typically come in as, well, don't worry about that. You're still going to be caught up. Don't worry. It's not happened yet. There are no signs of the times. But what if their concern didn't have to do with the rapture? It had more to do with the question of just not knowing. Because they were looking for it, and now they're shaken because somebody pretending to be Paul told them that it had already come. So Paul then proceeds to go on and give them a list of, don't worry, you'll know it when you see it. Here you go, and he gives them a list. Seems a very odd thing to do if the issue was the rapture. And so he then continues on, right? Don't let anyone deceive you. It's the day of the Lord will not come unless the apostasy comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes a seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. That should reminisce very well back to Daniel chapter 11, which we've already discussed. And he continues on, don't you remember that while I was still with you, I was telling you these things, and you know what restrains him now, so that in his time he will be revealed. He does not say that's the church. That is an implied definition, and I don't think anyone who's fair or honest with their own eschatology is going to confidently say that that's the church, because he just doesn't say that. In fact, he refers to the restrainer as a he being taken out of the way. And then he continues on, then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will slay with the breath of his mouth, and bring to an end by the appearance of his coming. That is, the one whose coming is in accord with the activity of Satan, with all powers and signs and false wonders, with the deception of wickedness for those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth so as to be saved. For this reason God will send upon them a deluding influence, so that they will believe what is false, in order that they may all be judged who did not believe the truth, but took pleasure in wickedness, but we should always give thanks to you, or give thanks to God for you, brethren, beloved by the Lord, because God has already chosen you from the beginning for salvation through sanctification by Spirit and faith in the truth. His concern wasn't wrath of God in the day of judgment. It was concern for their salvation from hell, from judgment in that regard. But you've already been saved, so you don't have to worry about any of this. Hold things, all the things you were taught, hold firm all those things, and you'll be fine. And the other word I really want to harp on is that phrase, the apostasy. Right? The day of the Lord won't come unless the apostasy happens. When we go back to Matthew 24, we go back up to the phrase, at that time many will fall away, many will apostatize. We see allusions to that in other texts as well. Paul brings it up in 1 and 2 Timothy, that the Spirit states that in the last days there will be a falling away, an apostasy. And 2 Timothy 3, in the last days, difficult times will come. We're dealing with that kind of a context. So it really is quite a stretch to assume that it means anything else. So dealing with just these texts here, you can, I think, hopefully see that it's really not that confident. You can still argue a pre-trib rapture. I'm not saying that the book is closed and it's all done. I'm saying that it's nowhere near as clear as they say it is. And having been in that position, there were a lot of questions that I had, a lot of things. And these texts particularly being the problem, because the interpretation given just didn't, it was not one I was reaching on the natural reading of the text. It just didn't make that much sense. So that's to cover those texts. The other thing to bring up, and I'll start winding down here, but the other thing to bring up is the order. Right? It didn't start with Revelation. It didn't start with 1 and 2 Thessalonians. It didn't even start with Matthew 24. Well, eschatology has been, as far as a theological subject, continuously growing over the years, in the sense that you started back in Genesis, the promise that someone would deal with the serpent. You make your way through that a prophet greater than Moses was coming, and you have the prophets describing the Messiah and the day of the Lord. Daniel, of course, shows up and gives a massive data drop of all the different things to deal with there. Then you have more prophets showing up, and then Christ shows up, takes what Daniel says, references it, and immensely elaborates on it, and continues to grow the subject, not saying that me coming the first time has now solved it, but there was more to come. And he doesn't rebuke the disciples for assuming he would be coming again either. And then, of course, Christ descends, and they are told, the disciples, by those standing nearby, that he would return again in like manner. So then you carry on into the book of Acts, and then you find in the epistles more subjects like 1 Corinthians 15 being brought up. And you know what? Let's look at that one, right? Because what about the twinkling of an eye, right? What about all that? Let's pull up that section there and deal with that. Let's pull it down here and see. Here we go. So 1 Corinthians 15, it's going to start at verse 50. Right? So what's the context? Resurrection. This is the whole context of 1 Corinthians 15, is the resurrection of the dead. And if you remember, in Daniel 12, it referenced that. And then, of course, Paul writing to the Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5 was addressing the subject of the resurrection of the dead. And now in verse 50 of 1 Corinthians 15, I say this, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Behold, right, he's dealing with a context. You can't take your garbage old body and take it into the kingdom of God. It's not compatible. It's broken. Your perishable, the thing that is dying, cannot inherit the kingdom of God. So I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep. Not everyone's going to die. Right? There will be people who are alive and remain, but we will all be changed. Those who are alive and remain, carrying on that subject as dealt with in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, right, dealing with the resurrection of the dead, not everybody's going to be resurrected. So if you want to deal with the subject of resurrection, you can deal with it from two different points. Paul's dealing with the Thessalonians, who were concerned about those who had died and had forgotten about the resurrection. So Paul brings it up and explains it in the context of the day of the Lord to show that, hey, this is tied together. Here in 1 Corinthians 15, he's describing the context of resurrection, but also dealing with those of us who are alive, that we will not all sleep, we will all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. Well, that's just a symbolic trumpet. Well, let's put a little suggestion out there. Right? We know that in Revelation there are 7 trumpets. What if, and this isn't much of a stretch, what if the last trumpet was the 7th trumpet? Right? In the twinkling of an eye at the last trumpet, so let's say for the sake of argument, and I genuinely believe is a fair interpretation, we get to the end of the trumpets, and at the last trumpet is blown, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed, which fits with the layout of Matthew 24, I might add, as well as Daniel 11 and 12. Then in the context following the Great Tribulation, there is a resurrection of the dead. It fits just fine. Don't have to move anything around to make that make sense. And then he carries on and describes the effects of resurrection and dealing with death. So even 1 Corinthians 15 is not saying, in fact, I would argue 1 Corinthians 15 proves a post-tribulational rapture far better than it does a pre-tribulational rapture. The only reason they go to this text is to deal with the subject of imminency. So there are other texts, there are other debates to be had out there, but these were the main ones that I really wanted to go over. There are some smaller arguments, like the subject of imminency. One of the issues you're going to run into with that is that there's really not a text that directly states that. Well, no man knows the day or the hour. That's true. The day of the Lord will come like a thief when you're not expecting it. That's true. But that does not mean directly by implication that there are no signs that precede it, because those texts were sandwiched and smothered in signs, and Jesus proceeds to go on in Matthew chapter 24 and describe signs and talk about the fig tree and how you need to be watching of the signs. In 1 Thessalonians 5, right? You already know the times and the epochs. You know the signs and the seasons. You're familiar with these things. You know what's going to happen. Paul adds to that list in 2 Thessalonians 2. He does not detract from it. There is never a discouragement to look for the signs anywhere in the New Testament. It's just not there. So the idea that imminency means in a split second, all these things as far as the church being caught up is going to happen, is just, that's not the context here. In the twinkling of an eye is at the last trumpet, which means 6 other trumpets and the seals have already occurred before this point. And you bring in Matthew 24, the Great Tribulation has already been underway. Daniel 11 and 12, a whole bunch of other things have already happened out of this point. So sure, I believe that when the rapture happens, it's going to be very fast. That does not mean that that speed is going to occur before everything else. It's just simply not a logical conclusion that you could hold to with a simple linear interpretation of the text. So that's dealing with that particular subject, and there's more that can be said on it. But I just don't think it's as cut and dry as they would argue about. Some say, well, the 24 elders in Revelation, there's the church, right? They're there before all these things begin. Revelation never calls them the church. That's never said of them. And you will not find anywhere in the New or Old Testament 24 elders representing the church. It's just not there. You can say, well, 12 divided by 2 is 12, or 24 divided by 2 is 12, so you have 2 groups of 12. Sure. You can speculate that's the 12 disciples or the 12 apostles, and you could speculate that's the 12 sons of Israel. Okay. That doesn't mean the church has been taken out of the planet before all these things begin, and Revelation certainly does not say that. Not anywhere directly. And then finally, if you really, really, really want to put a quandary, put a rock in their shoe, the tribulation saints, they are a problem. The pre-tribulation rapturist has been putting together their point of view, and they've been using all the pieces and following the instructions written up for all the theologians that support their view, and they've been taking their texts, and certain things don't seem natural, but they put them in the order they perceive. But then they have some extra pieces. And those extra pieces suggest that they miss something. And this is where your dispensationalism, this is where your theology is really going to have a problem if you hold to this position. If you're going to argue that the church was raptured before the tribulation, and the reason the church is raptured before the tribulation is that God does not want the church to undergo wrath. He does not want them to be in the tribulation, because apparently they're going to get affected by that if they're in the tribulation. That God has not destined us for darkness, and he's going to save us from this. Well, what do you do with his Gentiles in the tribulation? We know they're there. Matthew 24 certainly implies that there are people around the earth. There are Gentiles being saved. Well, what do you do with them? Are they the church? Well, if they're the church, then why are they subjected to wrath? Why are they in the tribulation? Why are they in the darkness? On top of the fact that, according to some, the church is busy in the marriage supper of the Lamb during the tribulation. So I guess these guys get to miss out. They're not Israel, unless you really want to stretch your theology there and try to mold them into one clump of individual believers. Israel is still a distinct category, and again, this is where the premillennialism is really going to kick in. So you have a really hard time saying that these tribulation saints are those, so you have to create a new category. You have to take those extra pieces and make something of them You have to. So you make a group. And so the category of tribulation saints is a title, is a group made out of necessity. They have to do something with them because they don't know what else to do with them. It is a fascinating hole in the theology that really shows this hasn't been thoroughly put together. And I think part of the reason why is because people never bothered to test it. People never bothered, especially from premillennial camps. There have been plenty of people from other camps that will poke holes in it, but I dare say they have much more baggage to deal with in other areas. But how many premillennialists challenge this view of the rapture? And so it's just not been tested that much. It's just been assumed. People just run with it. I am premillennial, therefore I'm pre-tribulation or rapture. And then there are really silly arguments. And I don't think anybody can honestly, with a straight face, say that this is a foundational argument. Things like, you're saying that the saints are caught up to meet Jesus in the air only to come right back down to the earth with him? You're just saying they're going to be caught up and meet? Sure, why not? I don't see a text that says that's a problem. Well, they'll meet him in the air. Sure. He's descending through the clouds. So it makes sense that if he's coming to touch down on the Mount of Olives and he calls together the elect from the four winds of the earth, that they are taken up in the air and fly over to where he's at and then come down with him. That's not a problem. That's really not a problem. I have no issue saying that we are caught up together in the air to meet Jesus in the air to then touch down in Israel. I have no problem with that. I don't see any textual issue with that from this point of view. And finally, signs of the times. We are encouraged. Yes, no man knows the day or the hour. I have no problem with that. I don't know the day or the hour. But at some point you're going to. Even the most avid imminency arguer is going to have to admit that at some point you're going to know it when it's happening. When Christ descends from the clouds, you're going to go, oh, well, now I know the day and the hour. You can't use the phrase, no man knows the day or the hour, and apply it so narrowly that nobody could ever know, because at some point you're going to know. The prophets didn't necessarily know when Jesus was going to come the first time around. We do now. So you could say in a past tense, no man knew the day and the hour. But now we do. So I don't argue that Christ isn't coming quickly, and I do not argue that it will not be fast. I'm simply arguing that it's not instant. It's like labor. When that water breaks, right, you have your contractions. They start growing, and they start getting more consistent, so you become alert, right? You're seeing birth pangs, but they're just the beginning. Nothing distinct has happened enough to make you run to the hospital. But the moment that water breaks, it's not, boom, there's a baby. I mean, sometimes that happens, but that's not generally the norm. Usually it means the baby's coming. There is no going back. At the point the water breaks, you've got to get to the hospital or call your midwife or whatever you're doing, right? But you have to deal with it because there's no going back. That baby's coming now. The line has been crossed. It's beginning. So when I argue for the speed of the event, the days being cut short, it being fast, I'm simply arguing that it's not there's a baby the moment the water breaks. I'm saying you don't have much time before the baby shows up. That it is still very fast. The days have been cut short. And I would argue that Daniel does give us how long certain things take. It's just not instantaneous. And I don't think there's much of a basis to argue that it must be instantaneous. You can reach that conclusion once you've conceded other grounds, but you can't argue strictly that point on its own. And I think to end, this really brings up a particular grief of mine. I am more than happy to discuss a pre-trib rapture versus a post-trib rapture, and even mid-trib. Let's throw them in there. But not if the opponent is going to argue incidentals. Not if they're going to argue that, well, if that's true, then we're going through the rapture and that's not or we're going through the tribulation and that's not comforting to me. That does not change my theology. What you find comforting does not change my theology. It just means you need to change your standard of comfort. It means you need to change your view on what it means to be saved from the wrath of God. Maybe being saved from the wrath of God didn't mean you weren't going to see the great tribulation. Maybe it meant that you were saved from that lake of fire, from the judgment which is coming upon all believers in the world. Maybe that's what it meant. But even then, I don't think I even have to go that far. I can say that God is not accurate. God is not inaccurate. He's not throwing all the paint at the canvas and we just get splashed on with the excess. God knows exactly what he's doing, and he is very precise in his judgments. A man can be standing right next to you and undergo the absolute wrath of God, and you'll be fine. Because God knows those who are his. I don't understand why this is such a complicated issue. you can be more than comforted in the middle of a thunderstorm with tornadoes ripping around if God himself gave you a guarantee that he sent those tornadoes and he wasn't going after you. You could walk right up to that tornado and not have a concern at all. So I dare say that's more comforting, because otherwise I wouldn't know what to do with everything that's happening right now. So there's a lot more that can be discussed on this issue, but I think maybe there'll be more parts to follow this, but I really wanted to just deal with this issue from understanding what it is that they say, because I've been there, the problems with it that they're going to have to address, and showing that if you simply take the texts in the natural order that they were written and you follow them through to their logical conclusion, and you were to draw out from a line, from a starting point, and just draw out the events that are laid out, you'll reach a perfectly concise conclusion. And then when you get to places like First Thessalonians 4 through 5, and you look at the context of what he was dealing with, and then knowing what they already knew, when Paul says that he had no need to write, or that they already knew when he had discussed with them, he would have almost certainly, if he's dealing with the day of the Lord, discussed what Christ had said in Matthew 24 and what Daniel had said, among others, and the other prophets. So they would have understood this. So Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4 through 5 is not necessarily giving an absolute timeline of the end. He's dealing with the subject of the resurrection and then carries on to fill in the rest of the gaps with the other issues. But that was the real topic at hand, was the resurrection. Because these disciples or these people in Thessalonica clearly assumed they were going to meet Christ with the air. They didn't need that clarified. They just wanted to know what was going to happen to the people who already died. That was the point of the text. And so when people argue from a consequential point of view, well, if you say that then, and then we proceed to insert extra biblical things here, that's not a smart argument, and it's not a safe argument. Because if we're going to argue from that point of view, you can discredit any position you want to. It's not an honest interpretation, and it's not a safe interpretation. You can believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, but it must be on the basis of the text and an honest interpretation of those texts. You cannot refuse a theological conclusion just because you don't like what it means. That's not how the truth works. We need to change ourselves. We need to be sanctified and conformed to that external standard that is Christ, not conform him to us. So, a lot more can be said, a lot more likely will be said, but I really wanted to tackle this subject from how I changed and how I view this subject. Take the text and look at them for yourselves. Follow the flow of thought. If you have to insert gaps, you better have a very good reason to do so, because otherwise you simply need to change your charts and you need to change your theology and your presuppositions. Your presuppositions, outside of the bare minimum fundamentals like the deity of Christ and the virgin birth and so on, outside of those fundamentals, those subjective presuppositions should be capable of being changed, because eschatology is a very tough subject. It is very detailed, it is very dense, there's a lot of things to look at. If you come into it already think you figured the whole thing out, you're going to be pushed around by it. It's very complicated, and it will take time and investment. But I think it's worth that investment.